original title of this panel was Gender Politics, Theorising Multiplicity, which was broadened later by the participants to Intersectional Politics, Theorising Multiplicity. In the original brief, we had stated that the panel was interested in the discursive presence of queerness within art curatorial projects, the places and ways in which they are named and articulated. We invited perspectives that challenge the canonization of dominant histories to provide critical analysis of representational vocabularies and social aesthetics. What are some of the artistic curatorial strategies that help us think through questions around same-sex love, underrepresentation, intersectional marginalities, coalition and solidarity movements? How do these strategies help keep the term queer in dynamic contestation as a process of becoming, rather in terms of static identity positions?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming back for our post-lunch session. I always know that the post-lunch session is the most difficult session. But I know we've got three fascinating speakers, so I'm sure it's not going to be a challenge. The topic of the panel is Intersectional Politics, Theorising Multiplicity. The moderator is Adwait Singh. Our panelists are Ahuja, Natalie King, and Prathyush Parasuraman. May I request the moderator and the panelists to come to the podium? I will just read a short bio of each of them in the interest of time. Adwait Singh, our moderator, he's an independent curator and theorist engaging queer feminist tropes and formats to probe the intersections of ecology, mysticism, subjectivity formation, contemporary technogenesis, and biopolitics. And theirs is an integrative practice that seeks to promote collectivity, care, and cohesiveness within the arts ecology. Ahuja is a curator and professor at JNU New Delhi, specializing in art history. His studies on small everyday objects from ancient India have examined the foundations of South Asia's visual aesthetics from the perspectives of religion, transculturalism, and gender. Natalie King is an Australian curator, writer, and enterprise professor of visual arts at the University of Melbourne. She has curated 3 national pavilions at the Venice Biennale: Maria Madeira, Kiss and Don't Tell, the inaugural Timor-Leste Pavilion at the 60th Venice Biennale 2024, and Yuki Kihara Paradise Camp, New Zealand at the 59th Venice Biennale in 2022. And finally, Prathyush Parasuraman is a film critic and journalist with The Hollywood Reporter India and a columnist with Frontline magazine, where he writes on cinema, literature, art, and the broader zeitgeist. He's a guest curator for Cinema House, a weekly film program at the G5A Foundation for Contemporary Culture in Mumbai. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Adwait. So Adwait will start with his opening remarks just to set the stage. Each presenter will have 20 minutes to present. We normally have a Q&A between the curators for 10 minutes and then open it up to the public for 15, but that really depends on time. So Adwait, I'm looking at you to keep track of time. I mean, the more Q&A we can sort of squeeze in, I think the better. I think that's the feedback I got at lunch was, I wish we had more time for question and answers. Yeah, with that, over to you, Adwait.
Thank you, Meera and Anant Foundation for putting together this lovely forum and for gathering this rather eclectic set of people and bringing different art worlds in contact with each other, something that doesn't happen as frequently in the city as one would expect and want. I want to, in the interest of time, give somewhat of a brief introduction to the panel on intersectional politics. And then hopefully we'll get slightly more time for individual presentations, which would be followed by the Q&A. So intersectionality is a term that was sort of a gift by the third wave feminism. And it largely addressed the lacunae of the previous waves in the sense that it specifically focused on the subject positions of black women who felt underrepresented by black liberation movements, which were sort of spearheaded by black men and were equally underrepresented by the white feminist movements, and consequently a need was felt to come up with politics and articulation which was a little more comprehensive. And since then, the term has sort of evolved and taken on multiple tags, and it has sort of like traveled to different geographies where local adaptations of it have been found, something that I hope we will continue to explore in our conversation today. So in this presentation, we're going to look at issues of censorship, and censorship especially in the way it sort of sits with and is differentiated from self-censorship. And I would like to briefly mention this remark that Apni Sethi made in her presentation earlier about the tenacity of our refusal and how long does that go in the face of constant surveillance. So this is something that we will look at in multiple presentations on the panel today. Aside from this, we're also going to be looking at the delicate balancing act that a curator has to perform between institutions and artists, and in that sense, to say it somewhat more lightly, can also be seen as a drum that's beaten at both ends, as a mediator or a go-between, just walking this tightrope. Then we are also going to look at issues of privilege, especially when one considers curating as an ally and representing a position that one doesn't necessarily occupy and yet is put in a position to articulate or do justice to. What kind of ethics or considerations have to be made towards that. We're going to look at exhibition histories and how they can be an encumbrance or an enabler of newer works or works that are represented. How can exhibition histories be a snagging presence or something that could open up doors or clear obstructions in the way? And we're also going to look at the obscure labor. I say obscure because it doesn't often come to the fore and is missing from the display. The labor of preparing the audiences for reception of subjects that might be considered somewhat difficult within certain contexts. And what does that labor entail? So these are some of the issues that we're going to look at. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Naman Ahuja, to open his presentation.
Okay, hi. So it's good to be here amongst friends, to be able to deconstruct some of one's work and why decisions were taken to do what one did. I'm principally going to focus on my two big exhibitions, The Body in Indian Art and Thought, which was shown at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in 2013 and then moved to the National Museum, New Delhi in 2014, and had more than about 385 works, which came from something like about 70 major collections in India and the rest of the world, to be able to construct a narrative in 8 parts. It was accompanied by one book that was translated into Dutch, French, and English, which was the main language it was written in. Then there was a little exhibition handbook, which was the one that was made available in India, called Roop Pratiroop. It came out along with an 8-part television series, which was marketed then by NDTV made the documentary series, and it was marketed then by IGNCA as a DVD pack. And then I had opportunity at some point to be able to deconstruct the exhibition and write some postscripts on it, on what were some of the intellectual navigations that one could not talk about while writing the exhibition catalog, or writing about it, or presenting it in the television space, or doing the podcasts, etc. And how one used the platform of the exhibition actually to be able to generate more debates rather than be didactic to the audience and give them a narrative that was set out. One sort of cheroed the press, as it were, with a few remarks and some cleverly positioned questions. Press packs were individually tailored for each journalist and not made as a general press note that went out, because one had to curate it for the interests of the editor of that particular broadsheet or that particular news journal, and also be able to navigate that particular journalist's own media interests and pique their interest adequately. So that required a lot of thinking. We went mental in the process of doing this entire exhibition, but that was because we were battling in the name of tradition. And tradition and history have become the new battleground on which politics is being fought and thought through. So anything and everything I wanted to say, I mean, suddenly my business was the business of the state propaganda machinery. Suddenly they were interfering and they were super interested in what I was teaching and what I had to say from in my classes about Khajuraho or yoga, etc. And with the body in Indian art, it went absolutely hysterical, because we reached a point where across Europe, in Paris and in Brussels, there were advertisements that had come out for this exhibition in advance, which read, "From the land of Kama Sutra, from the land of Ayurveda, from the land of Tantra, comes an exhibition on the body in Indian art." Right? There were buses that had this advert. And the government of India had given me as a curator very clear instructions that there will be no sex in this exhibition. So or Khajuraho, anything like that. So I took photographs of one of the buses with this advert, and got off the airport in Brussels, and I was meeting our ambassador there straight away, and I went and presented this photograph on my telephone, and I said, will the ICCR and the MEA kindly make its mind up about what they want to do? Because this is what the ad campaign in Brussels says. And this is, meanwhile, I've been asked very clearly not to show any sex in the exhibition. And none of the sculptures from Khajuraho could be borrowed for this exhibition. It wasn't being allowed. And they wanted a very clear narrative. And I was battling with various officials in all of these places to be able to win the right to have any exhibition, any exhibit I wanted. And there were certain casualties which were unavoidable. There were some things which I fought very hard to be able to have in the show, and I lost the battle on. And some things I managed to squeeze in. And the way one curatorially manages to get past the state censorship radar also requires a certain kind of navigation. Now, the other intention of the exhibition was that it was an intersectional view, very clearly, of looking at India. The kind of brainstorming that went on with my curatorial team for thinking about India. Firstly, the very project and the prospect of this exhibition was such an Orientalist exercise. The fact that a foreign government could come to India and say, we want to put India into a single show, and we want the entire history of India into a single show. And those days, I thought, had long gone. And, with the image of man that Kapila Vatsyayan and everyone else had put together, I thought that was the last time that one of those kind of exhibition projects needed to be put together and could have passed. And yet there was this insatiable demand that comes up from the West to put India into a single exhibition. And I said, well, when was the last time you guys did an exhibition on the entire history of Europe and Euro-American history and stuck it into a single gallery? And I'll give you a space as large as the Palais des Beaux-Arts, and you stick Europe and America into an entire exhibition for us Indians. And when you do that, I'll do an exhibition for India for you in the same way. And of course, that was considered to be completely sort of impossible as a quid pro quo. And yet one had to get on with the job, because I was told that if I didn't do the exhibition, somebody else was going to do it. And the person they nominated to do the exhibition, we'd rather not have had that person do the exhibition. And so I had to figure out a way how to get on with doing the exhibition. And so I was almost put at gunpoint and told that if I don't do it, and then one had to think about, okay, if one is going to do it, whose India are we going to represent? And so what we did was that with the exhibitions, with the list of exhibits, we got different communities and people to be able to engage with the exhibition list. And we said, okay, how does this entire exhibition sound if I say the entire exhibition's narrative in Malayalam? And if I don't use an upper class language and I use a common dialect, and if I use this language or that language and I try to translate the exhibition from different linguistic registers to be able to think through the exhibition project. And the narrative had to be able to make sense from different perspectives of people, and they had to find adequate representation in the concerns of the exhibition. So it was very, very lucky that the very first press conference for this exhibition was held in Paris, and a very good leftist journalist. I was surrounded by the representative of the Western desk, the joint secretary concerned from the MEA on one side, the head of the ICCR on the other, and the commissioner of the exhibition. And one journalist stands up in the exhibition and says, we have seen how the female body is treated in your country. The Nirbhaya case had just happened. And we've seen how exhibitions on the body, on Indian art, tend to tell us all about the greatness of Brahmanical culture. Is this going to be yet another exhibition that puts forth a Brahmanical view at the cost of women's bodies in our spaces? A good journalist in Paris stands up and asks this question publicly. And I kind of felt so relieved, because now I said, oh, I'm sure the ICCR would like to answer this question. They must have got all the answers for you, because this was exactly what I was being told, that tum JNU wale zyada hi sochte ho in sab cheezon ke bare mein, so stop it. And so suddenly I said, well, why don't you give the answer instead? And so that was a wonderful opportunity to actually, how the media, I realized, was one's ally, and had to actually we had to work alongside the media to be able to raise the questions we wanted in the public consciousness. And so a synergistic relationship with the media began from there onward as a curator. And the necessity to be able to bring art history into different press packs and be able to communicate to different language groups in the press became extremely important for me as a curator. Now, having looked at India in these multiple registers, one could then take the concerns onto a global register. And I'd been privileged. Avni was talking about we all operate in our own, in the previous panel, we all operate in our own sort of circuits of where we are allowed to work. And I've been very lucky and privileged to be able to work on a global scale at a point when, having cut my teeth as a curator first at the British Museum, where I'd started working in 2001 as a curator of the sculpture department over there. I had begun to work in the institution at a time when they were very actively working at decolonizing their narrative in 2001. And they were actively working at coming out with storylines and changing the labels and putting out the narrative on how they came to own certain objects, and debates would be held about what was appropriate and inappropriate to display. And after that, when I moved to the Ashmolean to work over there as a curator, I found there were similar debates that were going on in Oxford, but the Oxford establishment was a little bit more reluctant than the British Museum was. And the British Museum was even more reluctant than the V&A was to talk about colonialism. And I saw that there was a different attitude in the academy as well as in the major institutions, and how they were going to deal with the question of colonization. And even before that, even by the sort of early 90s, these institutions had already started hiding objects from display that were going to cause a lot of controversy and that were going to be problematic to display. And there was a delicate tightrope that was being walked already. Now, the British Museum had just achieved great success for Neil MacGregor's History of the World in 100 Objects. And this became their formula to be able to justify the ownership as a post-Enlightenment institution for the great Universal Museum to own the world's history and showcase it in Bloomsbury, which very few of us can afford to visit. And so the criticism was that, okay, the British Museum must collaborate with institutions in India and give to India its collections, share its collections with countries like India, which might not have had the privilege to be able to have the material from the pyramids or from Assyria or from wherever, which they could now be, which could now be shown in India. And the CSMVS collaborated with them. But like good Indian nationalists, a question was raised, which was that the history of the world as told by the victors and as seen by the British Museum is surely not the way in which India looks at the history of the world. So at what terms are we inviting you, and at what terms are we going to tell the history of the world? Through whose lens? And our very vision of chronology and our very vision of history and our very understanding of cyclical time conflicts completely with the Hegelian view of progress. Right, and the world has been conquered with, the way of conquest and looking at the coming of from urbanization to enlightenment. And so a narrative had to be created where I was asked to pair Indian objects with world objects, and I had to come up with an Indian narrative to be able to question or dialogue with or support, whatever the case may be, the narrative of world history. And the National Museum in Delhi couldn't quite understand the mandate of this curatorial mandate, and they completely botched it in the display in Delhi because they just couldn't. The exhibition moved to Delhi as well, but the Mumbai exhibition at CSMVS was far more sophisticated, and a lot depended on the scenography. And they couldn't understand the politics of the scenography that went into communicating that narrative. Anyway, so we had the point that was being made in each gallery. We ended each gallery with a showcase that questioned the narrative of that gallery. We questioned the premise of the gallery. And by the last gallery, which we call Time Unbound, we showed a tarot card of Rahu. And we ended the whole exhibition with that one particular Pahadi tarot card made in the 18th century that showed Rahu Kal. And we said, we questioned the whole idea of telling history chronologically, which is what history museums do. And we questioned the premise and the method of the show itself, our curatorial action, and what are we as curators trying to do. And we questioned that in the last gallery of the exhibition. Now, having looked at all of this, today's mandate for my conversation with you today was to be able to bring a conversation around my obstacles in bringing a conversation on not just on gender and sexuality. This was a paper that got published by the MIT Press recently, but I've been asked to take a section, Mira's asked me to take a section out of this paper, which talks about bringing queer histories to the public domain, which was encapsulated within a larger history that I had written on my troubles with bringing histories of gender and sexuality into the public domain. And doing these things in the contemporary art space in private art galleries is one challenge. But the challenge of being able to represent queer history of India in museums which are supposed to be the mirror of our tradition and identity formation for the public becomes extremely difficult, and for the state apparatus to be able to accept it. So we've all seen that whether, even the artwork that artists that have been coming out into the public domain, these are some newspaper headlines with Hussein's work and the controversies and the relationship with Khajuraho. And that made me work on two margs. One was called Art and Conflict, and the other one was called Faked, Stolen, and Censored. And it eventually led up to a larger study on political history that was published by the Collège de France, which was called Discourse on a Label, telling narratives of conflict. And how do you take narratives of conflict and the history of, how do you artfully in museums tell narratives of conflict? And why telling narratives of conflict has become something essential as an essential function of our museum. Now, the commissioner of the body in Indian art, the chairperson, came to the exhibition, and he was a great patron of Indian art, and he was appointed by the government of India, and he came and he said, नमन की एग्जिबिशन में सत्यम है, शिवम है, लेकिन सुंदरम कुछ नहीं है. And I said, but Bibhats is a ras. Conflict is also a ras, and Anandavardhan has a long discourse on why conflict needs to be communicated and how artfully you might communicate conflict. And my debates didn't go very far with him, but I did put it down. Now, focusing down specifically on bringing a history of erotica and sexual and queer erotica into a public discourse is extremely difficult, because we've not even begun to ask why there are actually so few depictions of ancient homosexuality in Indian art, even though it was rife in the Greco-Roman world, with which India has had long-standing socio-cultural ties. Right? I remember the Naz Foundation asking me to say that, can't you construct, this was in 2001 again, when Naz Foundation had only just started, say, can't you come up with a history that shows a pictorial history of homosexuality in Indian art and Indian tradition? And I said, well, actually, it isn't there. And there isn't that much that I can actually dig out and tell through a history of Indian visual culture, much that I'd like to. And then over the past 25 years, one has been collecting documentation, and Raymond Bernier and Alain Danielou, when they had first documented Khajuraho, had poured oil on different forgotten portions of the sculptures and wet those sculptures with these extraordinary tall ladders that they had taken. And in the deep recesses of Khajuraho, they had taken these photographs, which the public seldom sees, of homosexuality. Now, usually when the public goes to these monuments, they come back so excited that, oh, well, we had Khajuraho in the 10th century. But not quite looking at what is the nature of the sexual engagement at Khajuraho and how patriarchal is the nature of that sexual engagement. That is inadequately discussed. And so to really come up with a more empowering history of even queer aesthetics was not that easy, and one had to position it in a certain way. So one looked at different ways as looking at contemporary art to be able to pose certain questions of ancient Indian art, because I've always despised this inadequate conversation that happens with my friends and colleagues who work in the modern and contemporary art world, and my friends and colleagues who work in the ancient Indian art world, in the pre-modern world. And there needs to be a greater dialogic space in our forums. And so Mrinalini Mukherjee's sculpture, for instance, of Basanti was put into dialogue with Lajja Gauri and then positioned in a larger gallery on yoginis and matrikas. And there was a way in which there was a questioning of the past as well as an idea of the inheritance of the past. Both were being put out there. Similarly, one had done this with different kinds of contemporary artwork, and one artwork per gallery was there to have this kind of a dialogue. In every gallery, it was intended. So in the gallery on birth and creation, you have to remember this was a context when Section 377 had not yet been decriminalized, right? This was still in an environment in India when the Supreme Court was debating these questions. And at the Beaux-Arts, we sort of created Sky Father and Earth Mother with the bottom half of the mud. And we created this sort of dialogue. We put the universal cosmic egg, the Hiranyagarbha, etc. And we positioned a contemporary artwork. And in the last of these rooms on birth, these three rooms where the gallery is on birth, the last of these rooms on birth dealt with the whole question of miraculous children and immaculate conceptions. And this became a good way to talk about the birth story of Krishna, Kartikeya, Buddha, Rustam, by looking at not just the story of Jesus, but the story of the birth of Mary, to look at the idea of what constitutes a normative, happy family, Shiv with his son, Parvati with her son, making a united synthetic family, and all of that. And we have all of these stories about the Naigameshas in the Kalpasutras doing, transferring the embryo from a Brahmin to a Kshatriya and from a Kshatriya to etc. And all of these transfers of embryos are taking place in Indian mythology, and caste being indeterminate, adoption being rife, etc. So one put up all of these stories about these miraculous birth stories, and in the middle of these all these different miraculous birth story cases that one had in the name of Indian tradition, in the middle of it all, there was supposed to be one artwork that was supposed to be a homage to Bhupen Khakkar by Mithu Sen, which was supposed to be there. And there, surely enough, I get a letter saying that the President of India could not be photographed in front of a work that might compromise his PR image. And we don't know where the press photographers might be standing, and the head of state of India and the King of the Belgians were going to go inaugurate the exhibition, and we didn't know, they couldn't risk being photographed in front of a man that was defecating, right? So, so I was sent a letter that was clearly that, this work cannot be in the exhibition. So I wrote back to the ICCR with quoting an entire section from the Rig Veda, where there is a long section on the pregnant male, right? And I got back a letter, an email saying, that's understandable, but what about the right half of this diptych, right? So the work reached Belgium and the left half of Mithu's diptych was exhibited, but they did not allow the right half of the diptych to be exhibited. So we had an empty frame that we kept over there as a homage to Mithu's missing half and of her painting. So there were all these anxiety, but there was a wall. You moved up out of this, and you came to a wall that was all about these Vedic pots. The Vedic ceremony, the Nambudris had made us these Vedic pots for a particular ritual, that is the Ukha pots for the Pravargya in the Agni Chayana ritual that are performed for the male and the female spirit. And these were these pregnancy pots that we had displayed alongside. Now, in the birth gallery, I know we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to skip the videos. But I had been very careful to borrow artwork from the collections of the Government of India. Therefore, I didn't choose a Mrinalini Mukherjee sculpture that was going to come from a private collection, because if I borrowed it from the NGMA, there was nothing they could do. Similarly, for the documentation to be able to show that same-sex love might be a part of the Indian tradition, I took a video of the Nagamandala ritual from Karnataka, in which the Patri, the priest, and the acolyte turn into Nagas, and they intertwine, and they have to spend the night together. And then the next morning, this couple has to bless all the childless couples of the village for their fertility. Now, for the reason why 377 was blocked was because it was considered antithetical to Indian tradition, and it was considered to be against the norms of marriage and procreation, right? And it was because it was promoting a life of infertility, and God wants it such that we should be all fertile and to have children, as it were. And so this narrative, putting this video, which was from the Government of India's own archives of the Nagamandala ritual, playing away, clanging drums, playing away in the Gallery on Immaculate Conception, could not be denied, right? And it was happening exactly at the time. So I'll spare you the clanging drums and the video today because we won't finish. Then we came into a gallery which was about the ascetical spaces and the akhadas and so on. And the Dvilingi Lakulisha led to the sort of importance of devotion, and the kind of devotional spaces where you have the Gita Govind paintings where Radha turns into Krishna and Krishna turns into Radha, and it's not just a trance moment of exchanging clothes. That's not merely what has happened, but Krishna has actually turned into the demure, shy Radha. And Radha has turned into the one who is making the move on Krishna, lifting his veil as she is going to seduce him. And, so it's not just a role play, but it is the becoming of the other that that love can ultimately lead to in the bhakti as well as in the Sufi context. And so the verses of very famous Indians who held political power in the past became relevant to put up over there. So as you see the disciple kissing the feet of his Sufi sheikh, we had a little quotation by Dara Shikoh where he says about Mia Mir, his Qadariya teacher, where he says, he exposed my chest and having pulled the clothing away from his own chest under the left nipple, rubbed it against my nipple on the same side and declared, take that with which I have been entrusted. So they are sort of heart to heart, right? They're chest to chest and heart to heart. And such a multitude of dazzling lights from his blessed chest entered mine that I cried, enough. Right? So the electric exchange between the teacher and student and in a homosocial environment was something that we put up as a big quotation over there, as we did with the Prime Minister of Tamilakam from the 10th century, Manika Vachakar, whose verse was very powerful. He says, I wear a cassia garland and cling to Shiva's round shoulders. Locked in his embrace, I swoon, and then we quarrel like lovers. His red lips make me giddy with longing. My heart melting, I search everywhere, and I fix my thoughts on his feet. I wither, then I blossom once more. Let's sing about the red feet of the Lord who dances flame in hand. Let's sing an Amarnai. Now, the verse is so clearly describing his lips, his feet, his wanting to touch him and be in his embrace. Again, this man held tremendous political power, but the Bhakti and Sufi spaces which encouraged this also come out of a highly patriarchal environment. And therefore, when we put up Bhakti theatre, and we look at, for instance, I had a video of Gotipua dancers, and those of you who come from India and are familiar with the Gotipua tradition also know that it comes from a thoroughly patriarchal space where people don't want to give their daughters to be able to perform on the stage. It's not because the boys are so adept at becoming girls. It's just that why are there so many boys who have to play women's roles in India? And that's always been a case because the girls have not been put onto the stage. Now, this has often been misrepresented all too quickly by in the queer writing of Indian history as what a homosocial space it is. But it was a homosocial social space by default that accidentally ended up becoming a homosocial space because actually women were being denied that space. It was not because it was actively sought out to be a queer space. So let's not write it up as a history of something it really wasn't ever meant to be. And so the interesting part of Gulbahar Singh's film, again, I won't show you the film because we don't have time, is that how the boys who don't just enact being girls, but they enact a certain stereotype of being a woman. And then they expect their real women to perhaps live that stereotype that they have embodied as men, And then the other complexity with this becomes that they're not just, they come off stage and then he's filmed them just being a bunch of lads walking down the street, completely roguish. Totally, their walk has changed, their behavior has changed. They have become a bunch of boys, completely. That flip from on stage to off stage personality is very well captured in this film. So we had this on a loop to question this matter, which led us to a gallery which dealt with, again, a work that got past the censor board purely because it was in the collection of the NGMA. Not because the large print was in the NGMA, but the contact sheet was in the NGMA, right? So Dayanita had followed Masterji, Saroj Khan, for a long time and profiled Saroj Khan and done this particular, been on set one day where Rekha was impersonating Michael Douglas as she examined Asha Sachdev's bosom with her stethoscope. And there was this was supposed to be a remake of Basic Instinct with Rekha playing the part of Asha Sachdev. The film was never released. And Dayanita was on the set photographing Masterji, who was choreographing all of this as it was going on. And because the contact sheet was at the NGMA's collection, I could ask for a work that was in the NGMA, but I could also simultaneously then raise a complaint that this will not work for display, so may I ask Dayanita Singh to give me a proper size print? And then the letter came authorizing me to get a proper print from Dayanita, and I could actually display the print that NGMA only had as a contact. So very interesting navigations had to happen. Now, since we are talking about colonial politics and decolonizing narratives, in India and the world, we had the last gallery which dealt with issues of language. And in what language will we talk against, will we ask for decolonization? In what language will we tell the history of the world? We may not even have a vocabulary for South American history to be able to communicate that with people, except through the language of their colonizers and our colonizers. So either we use Spanish to be able to tell that history, or you use Portuguese, or you use English. How are you going to tell the history of? So of course, I was running into these problems of telling these histories constantly, and how does one as a curator, in what language does one communicate? Like writing the narrative, even in Hindustani, the official translators were writing, 10वीं Shatabdi, Chol, granite. I said, of course, that's exactly what it is. Raja Chola, when he went to command his sculptors, he said, "Mujhe granite ke sculptures bana ke do." Na? That's the word, that's the vocabulary. So we said that, what is the vocabulary that was being, what is the word for that material? And we don't have an art materials vocabulary left in any Indian language any longer. For brushes, for pigments, for colors, for stones, for papers, we don't know what the shades of red are in Indian languages, right? And so we want to tell a decolonizing art history, but we don't have a vocabulary for telling a decolonizing art history. And so in the middle of it all, we had a Kenyan image of Queen Victoria casting a perfect shadow where she fits on Amrita Shergill's two girls. They both fit perfectly, and it worked quite well, because next to it was a jail-like barrier of the scenography, and you could look at Queen Victoria's silhouette, and then you actually did a double take and said, "Oh, really? But that is the same silhouette that is in the painting, exactly the same with two girls." And lots has been written about the two girls' picture and looking at it in different ways. Who is the woman who is looking at us, and who is the woman who is really blind? Rather like Modigliani's figures, this one also has these no pupils on the Caucasian woman, whereas it is the brown sister who seems to have pupils, and she is the one who's looking out at us and into the future. So it's quite an interesting picture in itself to look at. So what I've tried to do in my little presentation today is to, here at least you can see some of the stills of the Naga Mandala and the other video. I tried to sort of piece together some of these things that have gone into, and my negotiations as a curator in the public space, in trying to tell these histories, locating contemporary art within a discourse of tradition, and seeing how the contemporary has the right to both inherit as well as question tradition, to find a linguistic register to be able to talk about these kinds of issues which are germane to us, and not let them be sort of antithetical to the Indian tradition, and what kind of hoops we as curators sometimes have to go through in that process. So that's it.
I want to thank the Anant Foundation for inviting me on this lovely panel. I want to start with Pedro Lamebal. He's a Chilean queer writer, activist, and provocateur, as you can see. For context, Lamebal lived through the AIDS epidemic and the collapse of Pinochet's regime. He was fiercely against both the right wing and also the neoliberal parade. He is famous for his irreverent chronicas. It's like a genre of writing which is a mix of reportage, of history, of poetry, philosophy. It's one of those things that's hard to tie a noose around. It keeps slipping definition. This quote is from Manifesto, which he delivered as an intervention during a left-wing political action in 1986. This was the fag end of Pinochet's regime, no pun intended. He was not just against the conservatives, as you can see. He was also he delighted in denouncing the homophobia of the left, of the Marxists. And he came to this political action meeting uninvited. He was in heels, he was wearing makeup of a hammer and sickle, and he gave this lovely quote to us. I'm starting with him as a frame because he was on my mind a lot as I was thinking through this text. Particularly three things. One is his irreverence, the capacity to say fuck you to any demands for respectability that he held on to in his writings. But also how he never festered in themes and ideas. There was an immediacy to his writing, to his art making. And by immediacy, I mean something that's sort of full of detail and full of energy, a vitality. Gwendolyn Harper, who translated his work, said it's as though he's speaking to a firing squad. That's the immediacy with which he would write. He was uninterested in abstracting away from life. He wanted to stay as close as possible to the energy and the details of life and not the narration of it. And the third reason was that his dissatisfaction with words to describe desire, but that dissatisfaction never stopped him from trying. He would fling words to the page like paint on a wall. Desire was at the heart of everything that he wrote. And as we know, desire is not politically well behaved, and Lemebel had no interest in decorum. I want to keep him in mind particularly because what I'm trying to do here today is abstract away from something concrete. I want to speak about Sunil Gupta's retrospective and do a brief detour about my work as a film programmer in Bombay. But I'll keep finding threads and tugging at them into questions which are abstract enough for all of you to find meaning in it. Well, that's the hope. But not so abstract that we all float away. That's also the hope. In that sense, I'm keeping Lemebel as like a balloon stand, preventing any flight from life. Photographer Sunil Gupta's recently concluded retrospective took place out in the sun on the grounds of the Government Museum in Egmore in Chennai, a career worth of photographic enquiries into the gay experience and frozen gazes of photographed faces exposed to the elements, which is mostly Chennai heat, but also stray dogs of the museum compound who keep chewing on these exhibition prints, which then have to be regularly replaced when they're flayed beyond canine disrepair. Interestingly, as you can note, words like sex, condoms, and blowjob are blotted out by black ink. When I sent this photo to a friend and I asked him, what do you think it says? He said, is it Bhelpuri? Is this an act of censorship that these words are removed? Or is it an act of audacity that these words were there in the first place to leave a trace behind? Imagine walking into a room, butt naked save for your jockstrap. You are told at the entrance that this is not respectable attire. You do not leave. What you do instead is wear pants so tight that the imprint of the jockstrap is seen anyway. This is that. To call it censorship, I think, forgets something fundamentally winking about the act itself. Calling it censorship, you're turning away from the act to its context. Another useful category to think about here is translucence, which is to say what you want to say, but not so clearly, but also clearly enough for the discerning eye to catch on. Calling something a coping mechanism can tend to make us fixate on the compulsion to cope rather than the method of coping. I'm more interested in the method. What do we do with the chains? How do we dance in it? It's one way you can stay closer to the act, one way you can stay closer to life itself. While speaking to Sunil and his curator, who's also his partner, Charan Singh, I was told that there were 3 formal layers that they had to go through for this exhibition, including presenting the final selection to the director of the museum. Charan had said to me, and I quote him, "It's the hiding of these words that actually makes them more visible." What is it then that can be shown by being rendered hidden? What is it then that can screech louder by being muffled? Central here is also the relationship between censorship and respectability. They do have common roots. This desire to be presentable, and by being presentable, predictable. It's that which cools the engine of censorship. Order is another form of censorship. Discipline is another form of censorship. This is Gupta's first retrospective in India, also according to the art newspaper, the first time that explicitly queer work by a living artist has been shown in an Indian public institution. Gupta's last non-commercial show in India was held in 2012 at the New Delhi chapter of the Alliance Française. That was raided and shut down by the police a day after it opened. Since then, Gupta has shown in Delhi's, but in commercial art galleries, which Gupta calls controlled environments. This, in Chennai, as you can see, is a public space. He was nervous, and he had every reason to be. I was told by the Biennale team members on site that they had some bristling encounters, including a man who wanted the portraits of the queer couples to be taken down. But then there were also kids who were guided through the exhibition, and at the end of which they had to fill a questionnaire. To the question what themes they saw running through the exhibition, one kid wrote, boy, boy, love, girl, girl, love, boy, girl, love. The exhibition is designed in a meticulous way such that the perpendicular noontime heat doesn't blind the images or the slanted dusk does not overwhelm the photographed lighting itself. But also storytelling-wise, as you enter this space, this is how it looks as you enter this space. Sorry, this is the back side of it. But as you enter this space, what you first see are photographs of queer couples, of his family members, and a sober letter that Charan wrote to Sunil. The provocations, the aesthetic provocations, the narrative, the erotic provocations, they happen as you move into this space, as you move through this space. This was conscious, to be inviting with the images that don't provoke you immediately, and by inviting the people, letting them fall into the embrace of the work, to then poke and prod them. This is conscious because Sunil sees this retrospective as a post-Section 377-1. While speaking to him, he was clear that while the 377 arguments were intensely focused around sex, the act of sex, and legalizing the act of gay sex, now the conversation was about the relationship itself. And as many of you may know, the Supreme Court has declined to legalize same-sex unions. The mandate here in this exhibition was broader. It is, as Sunil says, to keep queer kinship in conversation and to hope that this conversation builds into a movement which then flips the legalese. Gupta is also slightly sarcastic and winking about this. He said, sex can't be central because in India, a country where it takes men 5 seconds to come, how can you build an entire identity around sex? What of the rest of their day? I want to make a point here about the openness of the space itself. The museum has a library, and on any given day, you can see college students sitting on the grass, doing their readings, their homework, holding hands. I can also attest to the Egmore Museum actually being a cruising ground, especially because it's open to the public. You don't need tickets to walk through the campus, only to enter the buildings. And there are spaces of deep quiet in the hot afternoons, and about the evenings, the less said, the better. The exhibition too, with its jalis, its layers, gives space to show and to hide. I can regale you with stories of what happens later. The border between the end of the exhibition and the space that these students inhabit, the border between a space where people come to see art and people come to have public sex, it's deeply porous. How do you make the borders of an exhibit porous? I don't mean turning white cube galleries into dark rooms, but coming from a city like Bombay where you have to press a bell to enter a gallery as though you're entering someone's sacred space, I'm tempted to put forth this exaggeration as a sincere question. When speaking to Sunil about this, he reminded me of his first ever exhibition in India. This was in 2005 at the Habitat Gallery. There were works about his sexuality, but also his HIV positive status. There were no frontal nudes, though. There was a robust PR campaign around it, so a lot of people showed up. Back then, he said the shows ran for around 2 weeks and the artist was often present throughout. He felt, after a point, that people came to see not his work, but him, this out and proud gay man who's honest about his homosexuality, but also his HIV status. He became the spectacle. What also happened was that this space turned into a gay adda, a congregation with screenings of films happening, milky tea, crisp cold samosas being passed around. The spotlit works are suddenly allowed to become the background. The art itself is no longer center stage. Can we allow that? Can we let the narcissism of the art object rest for a bit? Over these addas, he also met the man for whom he would move back to India. That would end in heartbreak, but what's new there? What was created was not an exhibition, but an ecosystem. I'm interested in that movement. How do we curate not just queer exhibitions, but queer ecosystems, queer commons? And in creating these commons, how do we make sure that the desire to feel safe does not turn into the desire to be insulated? This exhibition is a retrospective of Sunil Gupta's life and work, but also of his frame as it builds with age, with the decades. Born in New Delhi, Gupta migrated with his family to Montreal in 1969, then followed a lover to New York, where around photographers he became one. Then he settled in London, where he was first shown in a community exhibition. He curated British artists of South Asian descent, closing the loop by finding himself back in Delhi, following a lover, before returning to London again with his husband, Charan Singh. His work is pioneering. It holds the weight of a signpost. The question why Sunil Gupta is best answered because Sunil Gupta. Gupta is in many of the photos with his family, with his friends, with his lovers, his cat-like gaze, mustachioed youth, disarming you. He's very handsome. You can't take your eyes off him. Traces like his underwear on the bed on his honeymoon keep trailing the work. There's a nagging sense here that these photographs emerge from a space somewhere between assertion and narcissism, between archiving an identity and archiving the self. Gupta's images, at their most powerful, they ram these distinctions. But at their most banal, they also tend to prize them apart. It's here that I want to bring in the question of being a pioneer and how the context of an artwork can embed itself in the artwork itself. Not as a contextual detail, but as an essential characteristic. Sometimes the myth of a work is so deep, its talent grip so tight, we can't dust it off the work as if it were a layer. The myth is interpolated, it taints the formal quality of the work, it contaminates it. And as Anna Singh notes, contamination is also a form of collaboration. And here I want to take a brief detour to talk about the work that I do as a film programmer. These are screenshots from two pioneering queer films. The one on the left, well, my left, your left, is from Riyad Vadia's Bomgay, 1996, and the one on the right is from the documentary Summer in My Veins, Nishit Sar in Summer in My Veins, which is in 1998. 2 years ago, I was trying to program these two films in Bombay, and I was facing a crisis of confidence because it came dangerously close to being undone a couple of times. Both the directors are no longer alive. There are no good prints available in public. I had to reach out to Riyad's brother, who was in a different European city, while a print of this film was perhaps languishing in another European city. For Nishit's film, I had to do some A-grade Instagram stalking, and I had to find out his then boyfriend, who then connected me to his mother, who told me that a DVD of this film might be lying in an outhouse in Delhi somewhere. These things needed to be fished out, digitized, delivered. Nobody cared too much about the archival value of these films. I was, on the other hand, harping on its value. Why was I doing this? Because these were pioneering films made at a time when no one bothered or dared or even imagined queerness as possible. When you're showing films for their pioneering nature, is it an academic exercise or an aesthetic one? Is it the erotics of knowledge or the erotics of beauty that I was chasing, trying to embody, trying to encourage as a programmer? Am I trying to force feed a canon? This is a question that troubles me a lot. What do we do with pioneers in a world that might not need them anymore? Just their myth, just the knowledge that they once existed. Coming back to Sunil Gupta's retrospective, The Vortex of Gorgeous Faces, the formal qualities of these portraits often gets waylaid and tilted, not just by the mythology, but by the formal beauty of the people in the image. He's hot, he's not. The act of swiping past the various portraits feels not too different from shuffling through a dating app, where it's the edges and limits of your desire that are being brought out. Blazing, forthright gazes, easy beauty, these images blur under the weight of the people in it. Desire is essential to queerness, but we cannot desire like a manifesto. Our desires run counter to our beliefs sometimes. The art that we show, though, tends to be politically well-behaved. I see a tilt towards framing queerness as a virtue in so many of the curations, curatorial write-ups, or even film programming. Tenderness being not just an affectation, but a fetishized posture. So suddenly, between the desiring body and the desiring body's representation, something abrasive and untamed is lost. How do we bridge this if we want to at all? Do we allow ourselves the permission to be unlikable, to be wrong, to be abrasive, even when we know what is right? What then is the duty of an exhibition to validate our desires, to affirm them? And what is the duty of an exhibition to challenge them and flip them on its head? And here I'll come back to Lamebal, who said in that same manifesto poem, "If I speak to you about issues and look at your bulge, I'm not a hypocrite." Is there a way then to look at the bulge and speak of the issues? It's in Exile, Sunil Gupta's 1980s photographic enquiry of gay Indian men cruising in public spaces in Delhi with faces lopped off by the edge of the image or turned away from its trapping gaze, that the photograph is an object of art, and by object of art I mean something with formal properties you can identify, aggregate, critique, that emerges. The ethnographic burden is also far heavier here because this was done in the 1980s. What Barth called the punctum, or that specific quality or detail that draws you in viscerally into the image, is far stronger here. It's tied to my question around mythology, how bodies are drawn to things, why they are drawn to things. By keeping the men anonymous, these are photos that are yearning to speak. The senses heighten as you stand in front of them with their naughty captions. Time, too, has a strange effect on the images. After a heartbreak in the 1980s, he decided to photograph, he being Sunil, decided to photograph queer couples. He made around 30 portraits of such couples between 1985, 1986, and a few decades later, he revisited that idea. In this exhibit, the newer portraits, which are in color, are larger than the earlier ones, And the newer ones are also shorn of that mythology, that poignancy, that urgency of the earlier images, many of whose inhabitants perished in the AIDS epidemic. The newer portraits languish as part of an oversaturation of faces we experience on the daily. Can a portrait exist without its story? Can a portrait exist without its myth, its narrative? As a work of art, what distinguishes it from the needless desire to capture, and once capture, for it to languish in some folder, some exhibition, some catalog, some hard drive? As curators, should we be interested in building that myth or stripping it away? Just like the artist, what about the idea of queerness itself? What do we do with that? The friends and lovers that Gupta photographs seems to have emerged from his social circle, and you see that desire to circle around queerness has not quite exited his socioeconomic class that he was swelling in. He had said, I took a lot of photos in the Greater Kailash because I lived there, not because there was something extraordinary about it. Later, he also notes about his lovers series where he's photographing the queer couples, that he decided whom to photograph based on people they ran into, people they knew who were mostly in the art world. It is when he's cruising, when the faces turn away, that the social barriers are crossed. Crossed, but not demolished. The crossing of a barrier is not the demolishing of it. The acknowledgement of an issue is not the solution to it. The anonymity is still coded in class and certainly caste too. But what Gupta is doing effortlessly here, without even theorizing it, is steering away from making a commodity of queer suffering. And here I want to bring in two feminist thinkers, writers, who write primarily about film, but I think their thoughts catapult into broader questions of art itself. One is Marla Cruz, who said, marginalized people are depicted as most authentic in states of suffering. So then, by refusing to sit with the question of what is authentic queerness, Gupta's work is irreverent, but not ignorant to queer suffering. Then there's also Rain Fisher Kwan, who's speaking about feminism mostly, a thread that I want to loop around the neck of queerness here, when she says, where is the line between representing gendered suffering and reproducing it? Is the sadism involved in chronicling a woman's endless abjection the price we pay for realism? And here I come back to my question about respectability, because by being comfortable, by being respectable, being predictable, being resolved, you make yourself ripe for commodification, for proliferation. This question should haunt us: how to keep a thing unresolved? Perhaps that is how we resist the commodification, by sticking to life and not its abstractions, pressing up against the details, not the narration of it, by inhabiting the energy and not the reception of it. To turn to the individual every time you're flocked into an identity, and to flock to the identity every time your individuality is fetishized. Photography today is struggling with this need to assert itself as an art form. When it's being so democratized, it's being rendered unexceptional. At the Chennai Photo Biennale, portraitures tainted by method, like the haunting paper negatives of Soham Joshi's images on the left, well, you're right, and the chromatic rush of Vivek Mariappan. To then see Gupta hold on to the unambiguous clarity of his images is to see him content with clear portraiture, clean portraiture as a form. But when a career has been made out of being a gay photographer and the exceptionality of the gay identity is now being rendered mute, where does the artistry go? In that sense, the retrospective is also a pathway for Gupta to emerge out of, to shake off. I want to end with this diptych. It's from Gupta's series From Here to Eternity, which are photographs taken as a response to a period of illness that was brought on by Gupta's HIV diagnosis. Standing in front of these images at the Biennale, these images just burst and ruptured. On the one side, you have a mundane life, Gupta either with his dog or in this case in the hospital. And on the other side, you have facades of sex clubs. You look at the facade, and the image invites your imagination, your voyeurism, or what people call curiosity. You wonder, we wonder, all of the things that would have been happening behind those closed doors. All of that sex, all of that rejection, all of the lives being lived, and all of the lives being spilled, cropped. I had a dirty and a very difficult question. Did Sunil contract HIV from sexual encounters here? A question so grotesque it doesn't even demand an answer, not even an enquiry, it's stupid. But to see him live alongside that petri dish of pleasure, but also pain, the fragment suddenly grows under the weight of a story that doesn't really exist except in its asking. Thank you.
feel like a bit of an outlier being the last person on the last session. But hopefully people will stay awake and I'll try and stay on time. So what I wanted to do today is share with you 3 curatorial projects that I've delivered at the Venice Biennale, really to explore the way that I've tried to work as an accomplice, an ally, an enabler, a confidant, a mediator, a conspirator at some times, the gamut of roles that many of us take on as curators. I also wanted to thank the Anant Forum, especially Mira, for inviting me. The invitation came out a year ago and it was, firmly locked in my calendar. I really appreciate your hospitality. And as you can see, I'm based in Melbourne, in Naarm, on Bunurong and Wurundjeri country, and I pay my respects to all First Peoples who are here today. So here's a glimpse of the 3 Venice Biennale pavilions that I've curated. The task was unremitting, exhilarating, complex. On the left, you see Tracy Moffat in the Australian Pavilion. She was the first solo presentation by an Aboriginal artist. The middle is Yuki Kihara, and I'll go into more detail about this case study. And she was the first trans Whawhawhine, Pacifica and Asian artist to represent New Zealand. And last year, I curated Maria Madeira for the inaugural Timor-Leste Pavilion. So I really want to look at Yuki Kihara as a case study today, given we're gathering here at a curatorial summit. This is often how I see my role. I predominantly work as an independent curator between different edifices, kind of hovering in between. This is an image by the Korean, New York-based artist Do Ho Sa, and I feel like it really encapsulates some of the precarity of, and at times invisibility of, curatorial work. But I try to work with a mode of care that has become a practice and a methodology. And today I want to weave together accounts of friendships, frustrations, recollections and recursions, anecdotes and afterlives. As has already been discussed, the etymology of the word curator and to care, and I wonder if we are all returning to this notion of care, given we live in times of conflict, troubled times of conflict and cruelty. But in 1362, curator the term was used to signify people who care for or are in superintendence of minors or lunatics. And in 1661, it began to denote one in charge of a museum, library, zoo, or other place to exhibit. But the word also comes from the Latin cura, or care, and it was specific to the display of objects. Many contemporary curators are deploying care and concern for their projects, and most importantly, the participants. And now I turn to Sami scholar, curator, and Louisa Ravna Finnbog, who I met when she curated the Sami Pavilion, when I curated the New Zealand Pavilion. And she writes about Indigenous knowledge systems and epistemologies of care from a kinship perspective, our ethical engagements with the world and our relationships with human and non-human others over time. Instead of considering care as provision to someone who has a lack, we can think about care as relating to all beings and practices. As Finnbog expresses, care is a doing. It is a chosen perspective, a much-loved value that shapes and forms how we move in the world, but also with it. But for me, care can be extended to an action, a meeting, an activity, a relationship, a responsibility. It is in the doing that it takes an active and purposeful dimension. So an ethics of care is fundamental to the way that I work, and I also like to look at Carol Gilligan's 1980s ethics of care, from a feminist concept grounded in voice and relationships, and the importance of everyone having a voice, being listened to carefully in their own right, on their own terms, and treated with respect. As an independent curator, I'm headquartered at a university, but I work across a multitude of contexts. I often try to build and advocate for the optimal conditions for artists through allyship, support, resourcing, and a commitment to developing habits of caring. So this is Yuki Kihara's Paradise Camp, and Yuki is part of the third gender community in Samoa, and she identifies as Fa'afafine, which translates as in the manner of a woman. I had been longing to work with Yuki for some time, and I was aware that she had participated in the Bangkok Biennale, the Honolulu Biennale, the Sakahan Biennale, and the Asia Pacific Triennial. We had dinner once in 2008 in my city, and Creative New Zealand put out an open call for an artist-curator duo to apply for the Biennale. So with some trepidation, I reached out to her on social media, and we started kind of a fairly rapid exchange about how we might put in a submission. So Paradise Camp was curated under pandemic conditions of deferral, isolation, uncertainty. Yuki was at that time living in Auckland and I was in Melbourne. We were in the most lockdown cities in the world. So how was it that we were able to conceive and deliver a Biennale under such extreme conditions? Delays of 1 year and at a time when shipping costs were tripled. So we were in constant contact, and there were certainly challenges in terms of seeing the work unfold, the lack of opportunities for studio visits, but we also were able to work with these conditions and the attenuated timeline. So here's a map of Samoa, and here I turn to Epeli Ho'afu's, the Tongan Fijian writer, his really formative essay from 1994 called Our Sea of Islands, where he looks at Oceania not as an archipelago of small islands, but from the perspective of the largesse of the ocean. He looks at Oceania as a place of optimism with Polynesia from the vantage points of vastness. So Paradise Camp was one of the gifts of working on this project is that when I approached Yuki, she already had a fully conceived concept. So that was one of the gifts. And it was, Paradise Camp was inspired by an essay that a Maori scholar wrote where she was looking at Gauguin's models, the post-impressionist painter, and thinking, could in fact these models be mahu or fa'afafine or transgender? And if that is the case, then Gauguin was depicting very early Polynesian queer history. Here is on the left a member of the Fa'afafine community, and I spent quite a lot of time in Samoa.
I see myself as a woman who stuck in a different body, not round body, but it's a different body. Might
keep moving, I'm conscious of time. So in the top left, you see an image of Yuki Kihara at the Met, and she had a solo acquisitive exhibition at the Met in 2008, and it was there that she as well as the Maori scholar Nahuya Awakotaku, encountered paintings by Paul Gauguin and in fact recognised herself. Yuki then undertook research to discover that Gauguin had stopped at the Auckland Art Gallery and was looking at Maori and Pacifica objects. This is some detail from the photo shoot. Yuki works very much like a cinematographer on set. She cast all her subjects were from the Whawhawhine and Whaatama community. There are 4 culturally recognised genders that date from pre-colonial times in Samoa. So there was quite an elaborate photo shoot, casting, finding locations alongside kind of waterfalls, rivers. There are also briefings with chiefs and landowners. We were headquartered at a resort, which was very good because we could all do our hair and makeup and get ready for the shoots. And here I turn to some examples of Yuki's work, and you see on the left 3 Tahitians, and as Shuda was talking about the idea of retitling, Yuki brazenly and audaciously upcycles and retitles a Paul Gauguin and calls it 3 Whawhawhine.
My name is Natalie King. I'm a curator based in Melbourne, and I'm really thrilled to be working with an artist like Yuki, who is immeasurably creative, habitually outspoken, very politicised and socially engaged artist who is working with many communities here in Samoa to produce a new body of work for Venice.
My new body of work that's going to be shown at the Venice Biennale is entitled Paradise Camp. Paradise Camp was inspired by an essay that was written by Ngahuia Teorising, who described how some of the models in Paul Gauguin's paintings may have been Mahu. I also looked at the paintings of Paul Gauguin on the occasion of my solo exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 2008, and then realized that the models in the painting not only looked Samoan, but they also looked Whawhawhine. Hence why we have Samoan Whawhawhine models upcycling Paul Gauguin paintings as a way to critique the colonial heteronormative gaze from an indigenous perspective.
Here's another example of Paul Gauguin on the left, 2 women and 2 Whawhawhine below. One is Tanya, who she started the drag annual pageants and Whawhawhine beauty contests in Samoa. And this is the subsequent image of 2 Whawhawhine going to church. Another example, When Will You Marry? And Yuki's rendition. Here are just some behind-the-scene images of preparations arriving in Venice with the most tumultuous aqua alta that they'd had in 50 years. And here's some images from the exhibition where Yuki, through Paradise Camp, shifts the optics towards a Whawhawhine transgender utopia from Oceania in the Arsenale at the Venice Biennale. We shared our space with Albania, partly because we wanted to coexist, but partly because we couldn't afford the full space, and assembled the exhibition with a wallpaper of the island, a talkback show of Whawhawhine critiquing Paul Gauguin, who they've never heard of, and an archive, which I'll get to shortly. Here are a couple of images from the archive, which indicate early examples of Polynesian queer representation. So in terms of the archive, I know from the first session, what does one do with archives and the whole idea of the digital dump, we actually made a selection and included part of the archive in the exhibition because it was a way to inform and extend the photographic images. This is the publication that we did, and there's been some discussions already to date about the importance of exhibition as publication, publications for dissemination, but as a standalone document. And you see on the left is probably one of the most daring images in the exhibition, whereby Yuki worked in a film studio with the filmmaker from Lord of the Rings for a week and transposed herself to Paul Gauguin wearing a hat. So it was the ultimate drag king reversal of a Fafafine adopting the guise of a white Western male. I've got 5 minutes. So we also, it was really important to build critical discourse about queerness into the project. So we had a Talanoa forum. Talanoa means deep and transparent dialogue in Polynesian. And this is an image of fa'atamas who are assigned male at birth and who assigned female at birth and express their gender as male. Then the exhibition toured, and we've started to, in some of the sessions, to touch on the whole idea of touring. It was important to bring the exhibition to the Southern Hemisphere. It opened during World Pride in Sydney, and we were able to extend the exhibition, commission new work, and also, because it was on for a year in Sydney, I recurated a section in the middle of the exhibition. And this is a new commission that I supported Yuki to work on, whereby she interviewed and worked closely with Bertha, or Harud Samu, who is a Fa'afafine based in Sydney and a drag performer who has done a lot of activism for HIV/AIDS. And Yuki made a series of small dolls wearing miniature versions of Bertha's costumes during her drag shows. I'm going to skip this, but perhaps I'll end here. So we did a forum in Sydney as well, and we really wanted to disrupt these kinds of formalities of presentation and formats. So we invited Cindy of Samoa, who's probably the most well-known performer in Samoa, to come and open each session, and I got my university to pay for it. So she performed as Tina Turner.
Good to be with you. It's my favorite day. I can wait till
So that was certainly one way to get everyone moving and start our conference. So I'm not going to talk about this other project because we're running out of time, and let's leave it at, I'll just put up my final image. Everything, I can't seem to move. So I just wanted to conclude by returning to the idea of care and putting the artist first. A good exhibition behaves like a guest who takes care to do whatever is true to the spirit of the work. And let's continue our discussion.
Thank you, panelists, for lovely presentations. And as we're nearly out of time, I think it would be best if we take questions from the audience first. Shudha has a question, and then Gayatri.
Thank you for great presentations, amazing insights into so many things. My question is for Naman. I really enjoyed you talking about the journalist in the Paris press conference, asking you a question which you then deferred to the ICCR chief. I want to talk about another journalist who is in the room, Mira Menezes, who wrote an article about the exclusion of work by Tallur in the New Delhi leg of India and the world. And it's a very and in fact, I realize that I am quoted in that article. There's a question that's asked of me, and I said that the director of the National Museum, Dr. B.R. Mani, is not the curator of the exhibition. So he made a statement saying that the work of art could not be exhibited because it was neither relevant nor necessary. So which seemed to suggest that he had arrogated to himself the title of the curator, where he's not the curator, you are the curator. When asked a question about that, he says, Dr. Naman Ahuja was given all the labels to look at, which is not the question. Then he says that the work could not be shown because the work had to travel by air from Mumbai to Delhi via Dubai, and it was very heavy. In the Hindustan Times article previously, he said it was too heavy to lift into the National Museum. There's several different kinds of statements. Finally, he says that as professionals in the field, we should be careful when we are representing Nataraja, because something should not be offensive. However, the work in question is not Nataraja, it's called Unicode, right? It's a reference to mining information. It is framed by a figure by a circle of flames, which you might recognize. So I'm curious, because what's actually happened is that the exhibition has come and gone. The publication includes the work. And then there is an article by a journalist in a magazine, which now immortalizes the National Museum director's evasions for the rest of time. Right? So it becomes almost a museum exhibit in itself, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay.
Immortality.
Yeah, it was, the National Museum was thoroughly unprepared for exhibiting many works. And then they had to do a quick cover-up for their lack of preparedness. And they found it easier sometimes to become ideological about their censorship rather than confessing that they just hadn't done the necessary preparation for making their lift work to be able to transport something that was a very heavy sculpture. They had not done the necessary climate control for some of the British Museum's objects. They had not procured the necessary materials to be able to handle specific artwork, which for legal reasons, for insurance reasons, have to be handled using certain instruments or have to be transported using, there needs to be certain ways in which that object can be handled. They didn't, despite being given a list on exactly what needed to be done about 9-10 months in advance for each work, and what the handling would entail, there was a lot of attitude with which one was told that you are dealing with the National Museum of India and you are surely not going to tell us how to run our museum and what to do. And so we just supplied the information. The preparedness was just not there. The sculpture is owned by the Curatorial Museum of Art. It had to come back to Delhi. It was available gratis. There was no reason to go via Dubai. There were many things that were said that were completely irrelevant. But that was not the only sculpture that could not be exhibited in Delhi. It was actually about 15 things that could not be exhibited in Delhi because of the lack of preparedness in Delhi.
So just to clarify, the lack of preparedness was something that they were less willing to admit to than ideological censorship.
Absolutely, that is correct. That is correct. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you for a lovely panel. I was wanting to ask Natalie a couple of questions, and but just to make one statement, because a modern Indian art history has looked at Paul Gauguin as influencing Amrita Shergill and her, representation of women, and now if it explodes in everybody's face that they may have been Papa Fine, then that's going to change the way we are looking at Amrita Shergill. But I wanted to ask you about the levels of performativity that are suggested in the paper. One is the conversion to a gender perhaps other than one's own, which one is born with, which is the fafa fine. Then there is also drag, and then there is also performance. You mentioned all three, and I wonder how you distinguish between these categories. I mean, this seems a little more nuanced than just simply say drag or simply just performance for the sake of performativity, photography, etc. This is a layered sort of sexual inversion, change, appropriation. I don't know how you'd like to speak about this.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. I think that they're very much, from what I could observe from spending time with Yuki and the Fa'afafine community, they're very much intermingled. So the performative element, whether it's the beauty pageants that are held annually, are a very key event in the calendar. So it's not the art fair, it's the beauty pageant. And we wanted to very much draw on that local, I guess quite camp vernacular in the exhibition and make it very much sort of dazzling. And so there was that element of the performativity. And also in the photographs, they are non-actors, non-performers. They're Fa'afafine coming in and adopting Gauguin's poses, but as themselves in their own environment. So there are all these kind of double edges taking place. And in a place like Samoa, so when we're in Venice, most people didn't know where Samoa was or what these kind of performative gestures might entail and signal. Hope that sort of answers your question.
Okay, let's take that and then.
My question is for Naman. Naman, I vividly remember your show, Body as Art. So there are two things. A, was it only in India that this kind of, the controversies that emerged from it? It was shown in
Brussels.
This kind of controversy didn't occur there, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, and then the other thing which I find very strange is that we are heading towards censorship of LGBTQ in the country, heading towards Trumpism, let's say. But in real life and in art, there is no censorship. People, same-sex couples intermingle freely, no one objects. And of course, artists go on creating works which are free of this kind of censorship.
That partly answers Charlene's question. Was there another question? I think we get away with a lot of things because luckily the bureaucracy has proved itself to be half-witted time and again, and the adjudicators of the censors, they pick on things which you would imagine they would never pick on, and many things which really are quite, out there, just seem to go past, and one has the luck of the draw, and as it were, because they haven't wisened up to the message behind the artwork, and so their ignorance is to the benefit of the curator very often, and we get by. But that's just being lucky, and we've all counted on that in a big way in a lot of the work that I'm sure we've all had to do. But I think I've also been a little bit stubborn, and I strategize a lot. So for every work, I have a second and third, and I tend to, for the big shows, I know that if they cut one, my point, my narrative will still hold because I have a second or a third that is going to make the narrative, and I haven't pegged the entire show on the presence of that one work, and if it doesn't come, then the show will not go on. So I tend to find a way. I overstate my requirements for the borrowing for the work, and I try and cover my tracks that way. But I think there have been battles where one has been in a situation where I've been happy enough that things have got included and published in the catalogue, even if they did not get into the show, because that in itself was very important to make a statement on the world stage with the, especially when you have large publication runs of something. So, for instance, the pictures of the Prophet that were in the National Museum's own collection, they came from Masnavis of Rumi and others, that the Miraj and all that were shown. And of course, I was nervous about whether it would ever be shown in India. And the fact that our National Museum itself had these paintings of the Prophet was something that was extremely important, because these were probably painted in Herat, at the land which is today under the Talib, under the Taliban. And you would imagine that this is exactly the kind of thing that needs to come out. So I was lucky. I knew that I was going to be able to. I showed it for about a week to 10 days. Till orders came that it had to actually, and the director could not protect me any longer, and we had to take it off view. And but it's there in all the publications. The Lakshmi in the National Museum was another very important case in point. I was petrified that statue of the Kushan Lakshmi is going to disappear from public view. For about 15 years, she's been getting put one. Every year she goes into hiding deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the museum, and she's not put on view because it's considered like she's expressing milk. The statue is of her expressing milk. And once upon a time, that statue used to be in the foyer of the National Museum as the earliest clear depiction of Lakshmi in India. So that has gone off view now. It's almost off view, and it was denied to me to exhibit twice. But I published it so many times that when John Guy from the Metropolitan Museum made a request to borrow it for the Met, he managed to get it, because there was no good reason to say no now, because such a big hue and cry had been made in the public. So one eventually got it out there. So you lose, but win eventually. I mean, I didn't win, but I made sure that they got to see, they got. So I think there are things like that to bring about some kind of a change and to keep these pieces alive, as it were, and not let them get damaged or disappear from public view. One has to really take care and be vigilant about the contents of the museum's collections.
Before we wrap this session, I had one quick question for Prathyush, and perhaps Natalie and Naman could also chime in. During his presentation, Prathyush, you were mentioning something along the lines of order being another form of censorship, a remark that was rather fascinating. And I was also thinking, surely when we're like trying to represent queer subjectivities and in the interest of keeping desire raw within exhibitory contexts, the selection of space must play into our considerations. And at what point do we decide if a stage is or should be engaged with? And at what point should one feel that it's right for one to withdraw, or like withdrawal serves a better purpose towards keeping true to that desire that needs to remain raw?
So I'll give the example of Sunil Gupta's, because he has explicitly erotic work, right, with his frontal nudes, and the question came up, but it was not like a question that demanded an answer, because the question was so ridiculous that can we actually exhibit these works in this space? And a possibility was floated that what if we create a separate space that just the adults can come and see, all these explicit sexual works. But of course, that was immediately vetoed, because you can't even bring it to the attention of the director that these works exist and it's possible that they be shown. So that is something that Sunil was very clear about giving up on. He wasn't insistent on wanting to show the dick, because he was like, this is a post-377 exhibition, like I mentioned. He wanted the conversation to be around queer kinship, and something central to kinship is desire, but kinship is not only desire. And so that's where he came from. He and Charan both. Charan was the curator, and they landed on that decision where they don't want to push on these certain things. Also the decision to open up with inviting images, that was a curatorial choice to, because that it's a government museum, so people are going to stumble into it. There's not going to be too much intentionality with the people. Like they're just walking in, right? Because I spent approximately two and a half days just around that area. I was milling around, just seeing how people were interacting with the works of art, who are coming in, how long are they staying. These are things that I was looking out for, and very few people actually came, with their jholas and their intentions. Most people just stumbled into it. They were going to the government museum, school kids were there, so they just came in. And so Sunil and Charan were very clear that if this is the space and this is the mandate, then we'll have to let go of some of our adamants, to put it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Thank you all for... okay. Mira? Yeah? Okay, we'll keep it brief.
That's okay, I have a really loud voice. We don't have to wait for Oh, okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Those were all amazing presentations. I did have one question, Prathyush, about something that you said that I'd love you to expand a little bit on. The first was the porous exhibition and what would count as porosity in an exhibition for you. That's a really fruitful idea I'd like to hear you develop. And connected to that, I think, is also the queer commons. These were things that caught me that I thought were extremely important, and I would love to hear more about what would count as an example of these things that you could create the affordance for as a curator beyond simply the traditional exhibition space for these practices.
I'm not a curator, so I can't speak from that perspective. I'm more of a critic, writer, whatever. But one thing that I mentioned here was that, can we let go of the narcissism of the art object itself? Do we have to spotlight the work of art at all points of time? That was the provocation here, saying that it's only once you let go of that narcissism can actually something else develop in that space, except around that conversation of art. So that was the broad thing. Because in both cases that I mentioned, the cruising in the retrospective and in Sunil's first show in Delhi, after a point, it was not about the work. The work was just a background. Now, I can't imagine any curator going up to their artist and saying, "Are you interested in making your work a background?" I think that might be too much, but that was a provocation. And how you all take it as curators, we all to decide. I'm just a troll.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Just to kind of say, tomorrow we start again. I know a lot of people have said 9:30 is early, but you've seen what a packed program it is. So we will start at 9:30 tomorrow with registration again. But the actual panel starts at 10, so you have time at 10. But we will start at 10 today, not 10:30. Thank you.